Hello everyone. Tonight we're stepping into the darker corners of Native American warfare, where arrows weren't just sharp, they were sometimes dipped in toxins, and losing a battle didn't mean a slap on the wrist. It meant your cousin was about to become someone else's adopted son. Think about this for a moment. A war party hidden in tall prairie grass, waiting for hours like stones that breathe. An arrowhead laced with plant resin and rattlesnake venom sliding silently through the air. Or a captive forced to sing while being tortured, because silence was considered dishonorable. These were not wars of uniforms and treaties. They were wars of ambush, spirit, and survival. If you're new here, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet where we discuss poisoned arrows at midnight. I promise, no poisoned arrows will be aimed at your subscribe button. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always like to imagine someone in snow polo listening at 3 a.m. with a fan buzzing in the background while someone in Helsinki sips chamomile at sunset. So dim your lights, maybe pour a cup of tea, and settle in. We're about to walk into a world where war wasn't just about killing enemies. It was about terrifying them, humiliating them, and sometimes absorbing them into your own family. Let me tell you about the person you could have been. Forget your desk job, your inbox, and your occasional jog where you pretend you're being chased by wolves. If you'd been born in a Native American village 300 years ago, war wouldn't have been a Netflix documentary you watch half asleep. It would have been the alarm clock, the school curriculum, and the neighborhood sport rolled into one. And spoiler alert, it was nothing like the romantic postcards with feathered warriors posing peacefully against sunsets. That's the kind of myth Europeans liked to invent so they could feel cultured while stealing land. Here's the reality. Native warfare wasn't all ceremonial dances and symbolic gestures. Sure, sometimes battles were staged with rituals, but often enough they were vicious, pragmatic, and terrifyingly efficient. These weren't armies marching in tidy lines with shiny brass bands. They were small war parties, moving like shadows, living off speed and surprise. Imagine your battlefield being not a field at all, but a dense forest, a frozen plain, or a canyon that swallowed sound. That was the setting. No banners, no trumpets, just silence, waiting to break. And let's kill another cliché while we're at it. People still love to toss around that phrase, the noble savage, as if native warriors were either Disney characters or stoic philosophers politely dueling at dawn. In truth, intertribal conflicts long predated European contact. The Iroquois didn't need muskets to start raiding their neighbors. The Comanche didn't need Spanish horses to figure out that mobility made you terrifying. War was always there, written into survival. It was about territory, yes, but also about honor, revenge, prestige, and that eternal human pastime making sure the other guy doesn't steal your food. Now, don't mistake small scale for low stakes. If a dozen men died in a raid, that was catastrophic for a village. Populations were smaller, losses were magnified, and mourning wasn't just a private affair, it shaped the politics of the whole community. One killing demanded another. A single ambush could set off a chain reaction of blood feuds that lasted generations. Revenge wasn't optional. It was practically the national sport. So, while Europe was busy with knights in clunky armor whacking each other for property rights, North America was perfecting the art of the targeted strike. And you'd been born there. You wouldn't have been trained to stand in lines or salute flags. You would have been trained to read silence, to hear the crack of a twig as if it were thunder. You would have known how to slip through grass without disturbing a bird, how to paint your face not for aesthetic but for camouflage. Forget camouflage jackets from the mall. This was mud, ash, blood, and genius level blending into landscapes. Warfare wasn't theater, it was patience, cunning, and the knowledge that the person who attacked first usually walked away alive. But here's the eerie part. Despite all this, outsiders kept writing about native warfare as if it was somehow less real. Europeans couldn't wrap their powdered heads around the idea that small, mobile bands of warriors could be just as terrifying if not more than standing armies. Which is why colonial troops often marched right into ambushes like tourists asking to be robbed. and robbed they were of pride, supplies, and sometimes entire detachments. You see, war here wasn't about flags and treaties, it was about survival wrapped in ritual, strategy disguised as tradition, and the darker it got, the more inventive it became. Which brings us to one of the most unsettling innovations. What happens when arrows aren't just sharp, but poisoned too? So, let's say you've survived your first taste of war, your heartbeat hasn't given you away, your bowstring didn't snap, and you're still breathing. Congratulations, you've earned yourself more war. Because here's the thing, native warfare wasn't about one epic showdown that everyone remembered for centuries. It wasn't the Battle of Hastings kind of affair, with scribes noting who stabbed whom at what hour. No, it was small, constant, gnawing at the edges of daily life, less like one giant hurricane and more like 1,000 mosquito bites that never stopped. Conflicts were frequent, seasonal, and often personal. A relative killed meant a revenge raid, which meant someone else's relative got killed, which meant another revenge raid. It was a cycle that didn't respect treaties, naps, or anyone's dream of a peaceful retirement. Warfare was the background hum of existence, and the cost of ignoring it could be fatal. Imagine living in a village where every trip to fetch water or hunt deer came with the quiet question, is today the day an ambush waits in the trees? And these weren't armies of thousands, most war parties numbered between 10 and 50 warriors, sometimes fewer, just enough to strike fast, leave devastation, and melt back into the landscape. The scale was small, yes, but the intensity was personal. One lost fighter could cripple a family line, a clan, even the politics of a whole confederacy. Death wasn't anonymous. Every casualty was a cousin, a brother, a neighbor. That made revenge less about military necessity and more about moral obligation. European observers often scoffed at this hit-and-run style, dismissing it as cowardly because it didn't fit their script of gentleman's war. But tell me, what's more cowardly, hiding in a forest and living to fight again? Or marching in bright red coats, banging drums, and basically yelling, "Shoot me, I'm right here"? Native tactics were smarter, sharper, and perfectly adapted to the terrain. They didn't need to win set-piece battles. They just needed to make life miserable enough that enemies thought twice before setting foot on their land. You'd have felt this rhythm too. If you'd been born there, you'd grow up knowing raids could happen at dawn, when people were still groggy and slow, at night, when shadows hid faces, or in winter, when food stores were low and desperation was high. Villages might be burned, crops destroyed, canoes stolen, horses taken. Every small blow was part of a larger game of wearing the enemy down. But don't mistake this relentlessness for mindless violence. Warfare had rules, even if they weren't written down. Some raids aimed for captives, not corpses. Others sought prestige for young warriors, not territory. Sometimes peace was brokered, but it was fragile, temporary, and always one insult away from collapsing. Alliances shifted like sand, and a tribe that was an ally one season could be your tormentor the next. And through it all, there was a strange, eerie balance. These constant, small-scale wars never completely annihilated groups the way European wars did. Instead, they kept pressure alive, kept fear circulating, kept honor in motion. The wars didn't end. They just ebbed and flowed, punctuating life like thunder rolling through summer nights. And when small-scale pressure wasn't enough, warriors had another tool up their sleeve, or rather, on the tip of their arrows. Because sometimes steel or stone wasn't terrifying enough. Sometimes you needed to lace death with something slower, more insidious, and far harder to shake. Now, imagine this. You're crouched in tall grass, bow in hand, arrow nocked, pulse steady. You draw, you release, and your arrow doesn't just pierce, it lingers. Because it's not only flint or obsidian meeting flesh, it's venom, infection, and slow-motion terror, smeared neatly onto the tip. Welcome to the unsettling innovation of poisoned arrows, where the point wasn't just to kill, but to haunt. Yes, it's true. In some parts of North America, warriors used natural toxins to give their weapons that extra cruel edge. Snake venom mixed with plant saps, extracts from euphorbia species, or other irritating herbs. Sometimes rotting meat was even applied to cause festering wounds. It wasn't chemistry, class, it was survival distilled into something grotesquely effective. The result? An arrow wound that didn't heal, that spread pain long after the battle was over. Imagine your enemy struck, not dead on the spot, but writhing, weakened, an open lesson in why you shouldn't trespass here. European observers were scandalized. Of course, poison was dishonorable, they said, as if launching cannonballs into villages was somehow morally superior. But for small-scale societies, every tactical advantage mattered. If you couldn't muster overwhelming numbers, you had to lean on fear. A poisoned arrow wasn't just a weapon, it was psychological warfare. The story of one man's slow death could travel farther than a dozen scalps. And let's be clear, this wasn't a universal practice. Not every tribe used poison, and when it was used, it varied by ecology. The desert southwest, with its venomous snakes and potent plants, saw more of it than, say, the Iroquois woodlands. But the fact that it existed at all tells you something vital. Native warfare wasn't static. It was adaptive, as much about knowledge of the land's dark pharmacy as about courage. You, of course, would have had to learn this too. Maybe you'd be taught which roots oozed irritants, how to carefully slice open a rattlesnake to milk its venom without dying in the process, how to smear just enough onto a stone tip without poisoning yourself. Imagine being 12 and already handling toxins like an apprentice assassin. Forget soccer practice. This was your extracurricular activity. And let's not underestimate the eerie theater of it all. An enemy struck by a poisoned arrow often became a walking warning sign. His screams, his infection, his decline, those weren't just side effects. They were part of the message. Warfare wasn't just about ending lives. It was about bending fear, twisting memory, making survival feel almost worse than death. Did everyone approve of this? Of course not. Some warriors considered poison dishonorable, too much like cheating. Others embraced it fully, arguing that enemies deserved no kindness. That tension reveals something crucial. Native warfare was not monolithic. It was as debated, as morally fraught, as any European council arguing over whether to torch a city. But whether you saw it as ingenious or abominable, poisoned arrows worked. They expanded the battlefield beyond the clash itself, turning wounds into narratives of dread. And if fear could do so much damage, then it makes sense that the next great tactic wasn't always direct combat either. Sometimes the deadliest move was to wait, watch, and strike only when the forest itself seemed to rise against you. If you've made it this far, you've learned that in native warfare, victory wasn't about lining up like toy soldiers and politely taking turns stabbing each other. No, if you'd been a warrior, your best weapon wasn't always the bow or the club. It was patience. Ambush was the heartbeat of battle, and you would have been trained to turn silence into something lethal. Picture this: dawn mist clinging to the forest floor, birdsong covering the sound of breath, and you lying there, face painted with ash, unmoving for hours. Your prey, whether deer or human, doesn't know you're even alive until it's too late. Ambush wasn't cowardice, it was common sense. Small numbers demanded cunning. Surprise tilted the odds. And unlike European soldiers marching with fifes and drums, because apparently noise is fun when you're trying not to die, native warriors preferred to strike from nowhere and vanish back into the trees. The settings for ambush were endless. Forest trails narrowed just enough for a choke point, rivers where canoes had to bottleneck, plains where tall grass concealed bodies lying flat, arrows ready. Winter even offered its own tricks: snow muffling footsteps, icy winds covering scent. You'd learn every angle of your landscape, not for poetry, but for predation. The land was a map, and every dip in the earth could be a trap. And ambush wasn't just about killing, it was about humiliation. To let enemies know they weren't safe anywhere that walking to gather wood or hunt game could turn into sudden chaos. This constant threat gnawed at morale, eroded confidence, and ensured enemies lived in a state of dread. Psychological warfare wasn't an invention of modern militaries. It was already perfected in the hush of pine groves and the rustle of prairie grass. If you'd grown up in this world, you'd have practiced stillness until your muscles burned. You'd know how to breathe shallow, so the grass above you didn't tremble. You'd wait hours, maybe a whole day, not twitching, while insects crawled on your skin. And then, when the signal came, maybe the cry of a bird, mimicked by your leader, you'd explode from invisibility into violence. One heartbeat, nothing. The next, death raining from shadows. Europeans didn't understand this at first. They called it treachery, dishonorable, savage, anything but effective. And yet, time and again, militias blundered into ambushes and watched whole detachments disappear into red mud or frozen creeks. The forest wasn't neutral ground. It was an ally for those who knew its language. To dismiss ambush was to dismiss survival itself. But here's the real twist. Ambush wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Many warriors believed dreams and visions guided where to wait, when to strike. You weren't just hiding, you were aligning with forces greater than yourself, bending chance to your will. And in that moment, when an enemy stumbled into your trap, you weren't only a fighter, you were proof that the cosmos favored your patience. And of course, if striking from shadows wasn't enough, you could always make the terror last longer. After all, if the forest could swallow you whole, it could also deliver you alive into the hands of those who wanted captives for reasons far stranger and darker than a quick kill. When the ambush ended, the battlefield didn't always close with silence. What came next could be even more unsettling: the taking of trophies, and the one that captured the imagination and nightmares of both native peoples and Europeans alike was scalping. Yes, that grisly act of removing the patch of skin and hair from a fallen enemy's head. It wasn't universal, but where it was practiced, it carried a weight that went far beyond gore. The idea wasn't just to mutilate, it was to claim proof. A scalp could be paraded as evidence of courage, a tangible marker of victory. In some tribes, it was tied to spiritual power, the belief that by taking part of an enemy's body, you absorbed his vitality, his bravery, maybe even a fragment of his spirit. In others, it became a political currency, a way to prove success to your people. One scalp could mean prestige, 10 could mean leadership, and then Europeans got involved. Suddenly, this practice, which had existed in different forms long before contact, became commodified. Colonial authorities offered bounties, so many shillings for a French scalp, so many dollars for an Apache one. Imagine that turning ritual into a grotesque economy, as if war wasn't brutal enough already. Some tribes even scalped more frequently, once colonial markets rewarded it, an ugly feedback loop of violence and profit. But scalps weren't the only trophies. Fingers, ears, limbs, even whole heads were sometimes taken. These weren't random mutilations. They were markers of triumph, symbols of survival in a world where being alive after a raid was itself an achievement. In some cultures, trophies were displayed in village squares, hung from poles, danced around in ceremonies that blurred the line between terror and celebration. And the irony: while Europeans condemned such acts as barbaric, they themselves were quite fond of severed heads on spikes, quartered bodies on city gates, and public executions that turned into community picnics. Moral outrage has always been selective. If you'd been raised in that world, you'd have understood that the act wasn't just cruelty, was communication. A scalp said, "We won." A display of trophies warned enemies, "Cross us again, and this will be you." It was theater, a macabre form of messaging long before Instagram made images the shorthand for status, and it had consequences. Trophies weren't just for enemies, they also placed enormous pressure on young warriors. To return home empty-handed was humiliating. To return with proof of a kill was to climb one step higher in honor. Warfare was as much about prestige as it was about survival, and trophies became the receipts you handed in to history. But sometimes, the purpose of a raid wasn't to collect scalps or proof of death. Sometimes the goal was to bring back the living. And if you thought trophies of skin were disturbing, the world of captives adopted, enslaved, or tortured opened doors into an even darker chapter of native warfare. Not every raid ended with scalps drying in the sun. Sometimes the real prize was the living. Captives were at the heart of native warfare, and their fate could swing from being welcomed into a family to being tortured in ways that made even hardened warriors wince. It sounds contradictory, but that was the point. Captives embodied the choices of war: life remade or life unmade. Imagine a raid on a neighboring village. Amid the smoke, warriors don't just kill, they seize. Children, women, sometimes men are dragged back, bound, bewildered, but alive. Why? Because bodies were currency. A dead man could give you honor, sure, but a living captive could give you labor, kinship, or revenge. And kinship was not metaphorical. Captives were often adopted to replace lost relatives. Entire Iroquois mourning wars were fought for this exact reason. Lose a son in battle. You raid, capture someone else's, and ceremonially make him your own. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival with ritual paperwork. But before we imagine this as a gentle adoption agency, let's be clear, not all captives were lucky. Adult men captured in raids were often executed, and not quickly either. Torture ritualized, prolonged, and public was common. A captive might be expected to sing his own death song, declaring his bravery, while fires licked his flesh. To cry out in pain was shameful. To endure stoically was to die with honor. It wasn't just punishment, it was theater for the community, a live demonstration of courage and cruelty intertwined. Women and children, though, more often became part of the community. Some were absorbed so fully that within a generation, their descendants forgot they had ever been outsiders. Colonial observers sometimes marveled at captives refusing to return when given the chance, preferring their new lives in native societies to the ones they'd lost. That alone unsettled Europeans. The idea that civilized captives might actually prefer what they called the savage life. Of course, captives also became bargaining chips. A person could be ransomed, exchanged, or used to negotiate peace. Bodies were political tools as much as they were human beings. Every captive carried potential labor, prestige, alliance, or leverage. If you'd lived in this world, you might have looked at captives with a kind of double vision, part human, part opportunity. And if you were unlucky enough to be one, your fate depended less on what you did and more on who had taken you, what they had lost, and what they needed. Were they grieving and needed a symbolic son? You might find yourself renamed and seated at their fire. Were they hungry for vengeance? Then your life became the script for a painful ritual ending. The role of captives reveals something essential about native warfare. Death wasn't always the goal. Sometimes life itself reshaped, humiliated, repurposed was the weapon. And when life could be taken in one of two extreme directions, it's no wonder that the act of torture became its own grim art form, a performance where every scream or silence carried meaning. When a captive man wasn't adopted, he was often given the stage quite literally. Torture wasn't a side note in native warfare. It was a ritual performance, an event where pain became theater, endurance became virtue, and the entire community played the audience. If that makes your stomach turn, good, that was part of its power. Picture the scene. The village gathers in a clearing. Fires crackle, drums sound, and the captive is brought out, tied but unbowed. He knows exactly what's coming, because he's probably seen it done before. His task now is to endure. To cry out in agony would shame him. To remain stoic would immortalize him. The crowd isn't looking for pity. They're looking for proof that their enemies are strong, proof that their own warriors are stronger, and proof that the balance of the universe can be restored through suffering. The methods varied. Among the Iroquois, captives might be burned slowly, forced to run gauntlets, cut, pierced, even fed food laced with ashes. Among Plains groups, they could be bound to stakes, shot with arrows piece by piece, or mutilated while still conscious. To modern ears this sounds like sadism, but within the cultural framework, it was more than cruelty. It was cosmic bookkeeping. The pain of one man repaid the pain inflicted on the community. His screams, or his silence, balanced debts of blood. And here's the eerie twist. Captives were expected to participate in their own ritual. They sang. Death songs were common defiant chants declaring bravery, mocking enemies, boasting of past deeds. You can kill me, but I'll die laughing at you. This wasn't bravado. It was survival of dignity. To die with courage meant your spirit lived on unbroken. To falter meant humiliation carried into the afterlife. Communities took this seriously. Women and children sometimes joined in the ritual, throwing embers, taunting, testing the captive's resolve. It wasn't just a warrior's affair. It was communal catharsis. The spectacle bound people together in shared vengeance, a living reminder of their strength. Europeans recoiled, of course, condemning these practices as barbaric. Yet somehow they managed to forget their own love of public executions, where people picnicked while criminals were hanged, drawn, and quartered. Pain as theater was not unique, it was just differently staged. If you'd been raised there, you would have known the rules. As a warrior, you might one day watch your enemy burn, and you'd judge him not by how he died, but by how he carried it. As a captive, you'd know your only weapon left was composure. Your song was your shield. Endurance was your revenge. And if you think this all sounds grim, you're right. But it wasn't mindless cruelty. It was woven into belief systems, into honor, into the idea that death should echo louder than life, which explains why women, often imagined as separate from the battlefield, played such decisive roles here. shaping the rituals and the outcomes in ways history rarely mentions. If you imagine native warfare as purely a man's game, you'd be missing half the story. Women weren't just bystanders. They were decision-makers, instigators, and sometimes even fighters. The battlefield didn't always end at the edge of the village. It extended into the council fire, the household, and the places where captives' fates were sealed. Take the Iroquois, for example. The famed morning wars weren't launched because some young warrior woke up cranky. They were often driven by women. A mother who had lost a son could demand a raid to capture a replacement, her grief sparking a cycle of violence. Adoption rituals where captives were given new identities were frequently overseen by women too. They decided if the captive became family, a slave, or a corpse. Imagine having the power to look into someone's eyes and choose between life, death, or kinship. That wasn't background work. That was sovereignty. And then there were women who went to war themselves. Rare, yes, but real. Among the Crow, there was Pine Leaf, who became a warrior chief and led her own raids. Among the Cherokee, women sometimes fought in defense of their villages. Plains women, too, occasionally rode into battle, bow and lance in hand. This wasn't common, but it shattered the neat division Europeans tried to impose between male warrior and female domestic. Even when not on the battlefield, women's roles in warfare were strategic. They encouraged revenge, kept memory alive, and reminded men of their obligations. A warrior hesitant to join a raid might find himself shamed by women's words or excluded from honors. If war was fueled by cycles of grief and pride, women were the ones stoking the fire. And in torture rituals, their presence was unmistakable. Women taunted captives, threw embers, and demanded endurance. Children joined in too. Pain wasn't only for warriors to inflict, it was communal. Violence and survival weren't masculine or feminine. They were shared responsibilities, parceled out according to need. If you'd grown up there, you might have seen your mother, sister, or grandmother standing beside warriors, calling out who needed to be avenged, reminding the men what bravery looked like. And if you were a captive, you might have prayed that the women saw in you the shape of a replacement child, rather than the outline of a body fit for execution. European chroniclers, of course, rarely understood this. They wanted women neatly boxed into the category of innocent victims. Yet when they witnessed women directing torture or choosing captives' fates, they recoiled, unable to square the reality with their Victorian imaginations. The truth was simpler. Survival had no gender. And while women were shaping the reasons wars were fought, they were also shaping what happened afterward. Because a captive taken in a morning war wasn't just a prisoner. He or she could become a family member, absorbed into the very community that had destroyed their old one. In most places, grief leads to flowers, tears, maybe a casserole. Among the Iroquois, grief could also lead to war. These were the famous morning wars conflicts, where the death of a loved one demanded not just remembrance, but replacement. Death created a vacancy in the family, and the only acceptable resume came from an enemy village. Here's how it worked. Someone dies, maybe in battle, maybe from disease, maybe from sheer bad luck. The family mourns, but mourning is not passive. Women, who held authority in clan matters, might insist that the death be balanced, and balance meant going out to seize a living substitute. So warriors prepared a raid, not necessarily to slaughter, but to capture. They would strike a neighboring community, take hostages, and march them back through the forest to face judgment. Now, judgment wasn't arbitrary. Once the captives arrived, a council of Fon led by women decided their fate. One could be adopted outright, given the name of the deceased, dressed in their clothes, and expected to assume their role in the family. Another might be enslaved, laboring without kinship ties, and if the need for vengeance outweighed the need for replacement, the unlucky could face execution by torture. For the adoptee, the transformation was staggering. Imagine being a teenager taken from your village, only to find yourself ceremonially washed, renamed, and treated as if you'd always belonged. Over time, some captives became indistinguishable from their adoptive kin. They spoke the language, married into the clan, and raised children who never knew they had foreign blood. The line between enemy and family blurred until it vanished. Europeans were often baffled by this practice. They couldn't understand how someone ripped from their community might come to prefer life with their captors. Yet countless records describe captives refusing to return when offered, choosing instead to remain in their new identity. two colonial eyes. This was scandalous proof, perhaps, that their so-called civilization wasn't nearly as magnetic as they liked to believe. But don't romanticize it too quickly. Morning wars were brutal. Captives were marched long distances, tied, taunted, uncertain if they'd be adopted or executed. Entire villages lived with the threat of raids, knowing that their children might become replacements in a foreign fire circle. It was grief weaponized, sorrow turned into strategy, and if you'd been born into that world, you might have grown up knowing that your cousin's death could trigger a raid, and that someday, a stranger might walk into your longhouse wearing his name. You might mourn your brother and then eat with his replacement at the same table, because the social fabric demanded continuity even when biology refused it. What's remarkable is how effective this system was at both sustaining populations and intensifying conflict. Mourning never ended quietly. It rippled outward, pushing one death to be repaid with one life. And if raids fueled morning wars, the arrival of horses on the plains supercharged the entire process, giving warriors the speed and reach to turn old cycles of grief into something far more explosive. If war on foot was already exhausting, imagine what happened when horses galloped onto the scene. Before the Spanish let them loose in the Americas, some escaped. Some traded raids had the pace of long marches and aching legs. After horses, warfare suddenly had wheels, wings, and a turbo button. The Great Plains in particular turned into a theater of speed, where a good horse was worth more than a chest of silver, and raids became mobile enterprises stretching hundreds of miles. The Comanche became the poster children of this transformation. By the 18th century, they were so skilled on horseback that Europeans marveled and trembled at the sight. A Comanche rider could lean sideways under his horse's neck to shoot an arrow, practically disappearing into the animal's body like a magician. And they didn't just ride, they lived in the saddle. Hunting, traveling, raiding, all of it intensified by horsepower. Villages that once seemed safe behind distance suddenly weren't. Dawn could bring enemies from horizons you didn't even know existed the day before. Raids now had new goals, not just captives and scalps, but horses themselves. Herds were stolen and restolen, fortunes measured not in gold but in hooves. A successful raid might return with hundreds of horses, each one a new opportunity for mobility, trade, or warfare, and the cycle fed itself. The more horses you had, the more raids you could launch. The more raids you launched, the more horses you captured. It was exponential violence dressed in horsehair. If you'd been a warrior in this world, you'd have felt the difference in your bones. You weren't trudging through snow anymore. You were flying across prairie grass, wind slapping your face, bowstring humming as you loosed arrows at full gallop. It looked romantic from afar, but let's not kid ourselves, it was brutal up close. Villages raided on horseback were hit faster, harder, with less warning. Survivors might wake two hoofprints stamped into the ground where their kin had been taken. Their herds vanished, and with mobility came expansion. Tribes like the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Kiowa expanded their ranges, reshaping the political map of the plains. Conflict wasn't just intensified, it was multiplied, stretching over territories that once would have taken weeks to cross on foot. Horses were engines of war, and the plains became their endless racetrack. Europeans, of course, tried to keep up, but colonial militias on clumsy horses never matched the precision of warriors who had grown up practically glued to the saddle. For them, horseback fighting wasn't an acquired skill, it was second nature. A boy could shoot before he could shave, and a raid that once involved sneaking quietly through woods now thundered across open land with terrifying spectacle. The arrival of horses didn't just intensify warfare, it redefined it. It made raids faster, distances smaller, and enemies more reachable than ever before. And yet, the deadliest transformations weren't just about animals, because once Europeans added firearms to the mix, war leaped from galloping terror to thunderclaps of powder and lead. If horses turned raids into lightning strikes, firearms turned them into storms. The first guns to reach native hands weren't sleek rifles, they were clumsy matchlocks, then flintlocks, slow to load, prone to misfiring, and louder than a bad opera singer. But despite their flaws, they changed everything. In a world where arrows were silent and battles could hinge on surprise, a single gunshot was both terrifying and mesmerizing. A burst of fire, smoke, and death all at once. Tribes who gained access to firearms early through trade with the French, Dutch or English suddenly held terrifying advantages over those who didn't. The Beaver Wars of the 17th century are the classic example. The Iroquois, armed with Dutch guns, expanded their power dramatically, raiding deep into the Great Lakes region and devastating rival groups. Firearms weren't just weapons, they were tickets to dominance in a landscape where balance could shift overnight. But guns didn't just add power, they added dependence. Powder, lead, spare parts all had to come through trade, so war became entangled with commerce. Beaver pelts, once a sign of winter warmth, were suddenly currency to buy guns, fueling overhunting and intertribal rivalries. It was capitalism with a trigger. Every raid could mean not just captives, but more pelts, more guns, more power. Of course, it wasn't as if bows vanished. Far from it. Skilled warriors often preferred their bows, which were faster, quieter, and more reliable in wet conditions. A well-trained archer could send half a dozen arrows before a musket even belched once. But the psychology of guns mattered. The sound alone could shatter nerves, and when used in ambush, muskets amplified fear far beyond the bullet itself. And if you'd lived in this world, you'd have seen the contradictions firsthand. A young warrior might wear a bow slung across his back, arrows fletched with eagle feathers, while clutching a flintlock traded from a French merchant who barely spoke his language. War paint on one hand, gunpowder stains on the other. Warfare became hybrid ancient skill mixed with imported thunder. The colonial powers, of course, loved this. They fanned rivalries, armed some groups, starved others, and sat back while native nations tore at each other in conflicts that conveniently weakened resistance to European expansion. Firearms were the bait, and war was the hook. Entire regions bled because someone in Europe wanted a new hat made of beaver fur. But firearms weren't just tools of colonial manipulation, they were woven into native strategies. Guns were incorporated into rituals, blessed for battle, sometimes even fired ceremonially. They weren't foreign curiosities anymore. They became part of the fabric of war. Still, guns alone didn't explain the persistence of violence. What kept warfare so relentless was its meaning, its spiritual underpinning. Raids, battles, and ambushes weren't just practical, they were tied to visions, dreams, and the unseen forces that gave warriors courage. To understand that layer, you have to step into the world where the spiritual and the martial walked hand in hand. War wasn't only fought with arrows, clubs, and muskets, it was fought in dreams. A warrior didn't step into battle without first consulting visions, spirits, and the cosmos. To modernize, that might sound like superstition layered over strategy, but within native societies, the two were inseparable. To fight without spiritual sanction was to step onto the battlefield already defeated. Visions often began in youth. A boy on a vision quest might fast, isolate himself, and wait for a dream animal or spirit to reveal itself. That vision could determine his role in life and in war. Some saw thunderbirds or bears, signs of immense strength. Others encountered smaller creatures, like birds or insects, whose gifts were subtle but potent. Whatever the vision, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a lifelong contract. When war came, warriors called on their spirit allies for guidance, protection, and courage. Rituals before battle reflected this bond. Feathers, paint, songs, and dances weren't just decoration. They were negotiations with unseen powers. Black paint could symbolize death or invisibility. Red could call for strength, white for purity of purpose. Songs summoned ancestral courage. A warrior stepping into combat wasn't alone. He carried his family, his ancestors, and his spirit allies on his shoulders. Even weapons bore this sacred weight. Arrows might be blessed, guns smoked in ritual fires, clubs adorned with symbols of power. To hold them was to wield more than wood and stone. It was to wield threads connecting the physical and the spiritual. Losing a weapon in battle wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Because enemies could claim its spiritual essence, battles themselves were often framed as cosmic struggles. Success wasn't just about tactics, it was proof that the spirits favored one side over another. Defeat wasn't simply a failure of strategy. It could be read as punishment, imbalance, or a sign that obligations to the unseen had not been fulfilled. The entire outcome of a raid could ripple into ritual explanations that lasted far longer than the fight itself. Even captives tied into this dimension. Their suffering or adoption wasn't just political, it was spiritual balancing. A death by torture restored harmony, while an adoption filled a gap left by spirits who had called someone away. The cosmos was always watching, always keeping score. From a European perspective, this blending of war and religion looked alien. Yet the irony is thick. Europeans themselves marched under crosses, prayed for victory, and believed God decided battles. Native warriors simply had different spirits, different languages, but the same conviction that war was never just about bodies, it was about souls. Seen through this lens, warfare wasn't random cruelty. It was sacred theater, a stage where humans and spirits corrode the script. Which makes the next twist all the more chilling. When war was fueled not only by visions and spirits, but by revenge so relentless it turned violence into a cycle without end. Every arrow that flew, every raid that burned a village, every captive dragged away known of it, ended in the moment. Violence had a long echo, and that echo demanded answers. Revenge was the engine of native warfare, and once it roared to life, it was nearly impossible to shut off. Picture a family grieving. Their son is killed in a raid. Mourning turns to fury, and suddenly the council is discussing how to answer the insult. Warriors are sent out, enemies are ambushed, another body falls. Now another family, in another village, sits in the same circle of grief. Their answer: another raid, another ambush, another captive. Each act of violence was a stone dropped in water, rippling outward into cycles of blood that could stretch across generations. This wasn't chaos. It was obligation. To leave blood unavenged was to dishonor your people, to weaken your reputation, to invite more attacks. Revenge wasn't optional. It was woven into the social fabric. A warrior didn't fight just for himself, but for the integrity of his kin. Failed to respond, and you weren't just seen as cowardly, you endangered the survival of your entire group. And yet, these cycles didn't necessarily escalate into outright extermination. They were balanced, strangely slippery. A raid might kill a few, capture a few, inflict just enough pain to settle the score or buy time. It was calibrated violence, meant to restore honor without erasing whole nations. Death was personal, targeted, but it always carried the possibility of another reply. Of course, there were times when the balance shattered. Long-standing feuds between nations like the Iroquois and Huron, or the Comanche and Apache spun into relentless back-and-forths where peace seemed impossible. Every treaty was temporary, every alliance fragile. One insult, one slight, could reignite the fire. It was like a forest that never stopped smoldering, ready to flare with the smallest spark. To live inside this system was to grow up with vigilance as a permanent companion. Every stranger on a trail could be friend or enemy. Every silence in the woods could mean danger. Children learned early that grief wasn't just sadness, it was marching orders. Even lullabies carried warnings about enemies lurking in the dark. Europeans, predictably, misunderstood this. They saw endless savagery, as if native peoples delighted in pointless cruelty. What they missed was the logic. Revenge wasn't chaos, it was justice, calibrated to restore balance. What looked like random violence from the outside was, from within, a structured system of accountability. Terrifying, yes. Arbitrary, no. And yet, when colonial powers entered the scene, they poured fuel on these cycles. Guns, trade, and alliances distorted the delicate balance, turning old feuds into bloodbaths with far greater stakes. The spiral of revenge became steeper, sharper, harder to escape. And colonial governors, watching from their forts, learned to play these cycles like chess, pitting one group against another to weaken them both. But revenge wasn't the only distortion Europeans introduced. Even more devastating was how colonial manipulation weaponized native wars, transforming cycles of honor into tools for imperial ambition. When Europeans showed up with their sails, crosses, and endless hunger for land, they didn't just conquer with guns and germs, they conquered by meddling. Native wars that had once been about honor, revenge, or balance were suddenly rerouted into the service of French, English, or Spanish ambitions. Old feuds were stretched, exaggerated, and monetized until whole regions bled for causes that weren't entirely their own. The French and British in North America perfected this game. They armed their native allies with muskets and powder, stoked rivalries, and promised rewards for scalps. Yes, scalps. Colonial governments literally paid bounties for proof of kills, reducing warfare to a grotesque economy of human skin. A scalp that had once been a spiritual trophy could now be exchanged for silver coins and rum. War became commerce, and warriors became unwilling shareholders in Europe's imperial stock market. The Beaver Wars of the 17th century are a chilling example. The Dutch, and later the English, funneled firearms to the Iroquois, who used them to expand their influence and devastate rivals like the Huron and Erie. But this wasn't only about revenge or territory. It was about securing access to beaver pelts, which Europeans turned into fashionable hats back in Paris or London. Imagine whole villages destroyed so that aristocrats could keep their heads warm in winter. It's absurd, grotesque, and absolutely true. Spanish colonies manipulated warfare in different ways. They encouraged raids among tribes in the southwest, offering trade goods and political favors to those who served their interests. Enemies were played against one another, weakening native resistance to Spanish rule. Divide and conquer wasn't just a tactic, it was a policy. And let's not forget how captives were entangled in this mess. Native peoples who had taken captives for adoption or ritual now found themselves pressured to sell them into colonial slave markets. Children who might once have been folded into families were instead shipped off to Caribbean plantations. Warfare that had once balanced grief and honor now fed European greed. If you'd been born into this world, you might have found yourself fighting raids, not only to defend your people, but also to satisfy the invisible hands of empires thousands of miles away. Your arrow or musket ball could be aimed at an old enemy. Yes, but behind that, it was also aimed at French traders, English governors, or Spanish priests pulling strings from afar. The manipulation ran so deep that sometimes peace itself was sabotaged. Colonial agents whispered, bribed, and schemed to ensure that alliances broke apart, that rivalries reignited. War was profitable, and peace was inconvenient. And native nations, caught in this spiral, often found themselves fighting wars that drained their people while enriching European markets. What began as cycles of revenge and honor now spiraled into global geopolitics. Native warriors were no longer just protecting their homelands, they were pawns in empires' chess matches. And the scars of this manipulation lingered long after the forts crumbled and the flags changed. But manipulation and bounties tell only part of the story. What really endured, in bones and memory, was the legacy of violence itself. Depopulated villages, displaced tribes, and stories that still carry the sting of poisoned arrows and ambushes in the dark. Long after the fires of raids died out, the smoke lingered. The legacy of Native American warfare isn't just in the scalps taken, the captives adopted, or the villagers' raised dits in the scars etched into landscapes, memory, and history. To walk through those lands today is to tread over layers of grief, resilience, and survival strategies that outsiders still misunderstand. Villages once numbering in the thousands dwindled under the weight of repeated conflicts, epidemics, and colonial interference. Some groups vanished altogether, absorbed into others through adoption or annihilation. Borders drawn on modern maps hide the reality that entire nations were reshaped, displaced, or erased through centuries of war. A war party's ambush in the 17th century could ripple forward into a treaty in the 18th, into forced removal in the 19th, into marginalization that still echoes today. Violence was never a one-off event. It was generational debt. Captivity narratives became one way this legacy survived. Europeans who had been taken captive published accounts, sometimes sensationalized, sometimes painfully accurate, that fed stereotypes of savage cruelty. Yet those same narratives often admitted something Europeans couldn't stand. Many captives assimilated and refused to leave. The endurance of adoption as a practice meant that native wars didn't always destroy, they also rebuilt. But rebuilding through violence left marks on both sides. Archaeological evidence fills in the rest. Burned palisades, mass graves, arrowheads lodged in rib cages, sites of massacres like Crow Creek in South Dakota, where hundreds were slaughtered centuries before Europeans arrived, remind us that intertribal violence was not an invention of colonization. But the scale, frequency, and brutality were undeniably magnified once empires began feeding the machine with guns, rum, and scalp bounties. Even oral traditions carry this weight. Stories passed down through generations still recall raids, ambushes, tortures, and the courage of warriors who endured them. These weren't bedtime stories, they were warnings, lessons, ways of remembering who you were and what it cost to remain. To forget the cycle was to risk being swallowed by it again. And then there's the irony of how this legacy has been remembered. For centuries, Europeans painted native warfare as senseless savagery, while conveniently ignoring their own love of crusades, inquisitions, and industrial-scale slaughter. What was ritual cruelty in a village square was called justice in London or Paris. The double standard has never been subtle. Still, the darker truths of native wars don't diminish the sophistication of the societies that fought them. They reveal a reality that was messy, human, and deeply pragmatic. War wasn't ornamental, it was survival, status, and cosmic balance colliding in the most visceral ways. And here's the final irony. For all the blood spilled, the alliances broken, the captives adopted or killed, the true legacy is endurance. Nations survived, adapted, and carried their stories forward. The poisoned arrows, the ambushes, the cycles of revenge, they left shadows. Yes, but in those shadows, cultures persisted, holding on to memory like a weapon sharper than any flint blade. For many indigenous societies across the Americas, war was never just a clash of weapons and muscle, it was a dialogue with the unseen. Victories weren't explained solely by sharper arrows, stronger arms, or better timing. They were attributed to alliances with spirits, ancestors, and powers that occupied the world just beyond human sight. A raid that succeeded proved not only that warriors had been brave, but that the cosmos itself had nodded in agreement. The idea seems strange to modern eyes trained to count rifles, measure supply lines, and calculate odds. But in worlds where life was lived close to forests, rivers, and winds that could shift from gentle to deadly without warning, spirits weren't decorative beliefs, they were co-combatants. Every animal, storm, and dream was a potential Alor enemy. A battle could be lost in the material world, yet still won if interpreted as a triumph in the spiritual register. And the reverse was equally true. A tactical victory might be haunted by the suspicion that the spirits had not approved, leaving the community uneasy even while celebrating. Among the Iroquois, for example, war parties didn't leave without ceremonies designed to summon the favor of unseen helpers. Success on the field was inseparable from maintaining good relations with ancestral powers. Among Plains peoples, visions of thunderbirds or wolves were taken as signs of destiny, proof that the warrior carried forces larger than himself into combat. No enemy, no matter how well armed, could compete with a man who believed lightning had chosen him. Even the preparation for war underscored this intertwining. Paint applied to the body was not a matter of fashion. It was coded with spiritual significance. Red might signal vitality, black could invoke invisibility, white purity or renewal. To wear these colors was to declare oneself clothed, not only in pigments but in forces. A warrior covered in black paint didn't just look ominous. He was thought to be shielded from sight, wrapped in the protection of spirits who blurred the edges of reality. Songs, too, were more than morale boosters. They were offerings, reminders to the spirit world that debts of loyalty had to be honored. A war cry was not only meant to terrify enemies, it was also an announcement to allies beyond the human realm that the time had come to join the fray. The sound of voices rising together carried through the landscape like a summons. And defeats, when they came, were not shrugged off as poor strategy. They were interrogated. Had someone offended a spirit? Had a ritual been skipped or performed incorrectly? Was a weapon carried into battle without being properly blessed? These questions mattered as much as whether an arrow had flown straight. Communities feared not only the enemy's strength, but the possibility that invisible contracts had been broken. Understanding warfare in this light demands stepping away from neat military charts and into a worldview where the battlefield stretched into the sky, the rivers, the dreams of children, and the bones of ancestors. Every spear thrown carried not just force but intention. Every shield lifted bore not only wood but the echo of prayers. And because alliances with spirits began long before battle, the process of securing them started in youth. During lonely fasts and visionary ordeals that carved warriors into vessels of something greater, the road to becoming a warrior didn't begin with a bow in hand. It began with hunger, solitude, and the expectation that sooner or later, something from the other world would pay a visit. Vision quests were the crucible fasts taken in forests, on mountaintops, or in secluded clearings where the body weakened and the mind sharpened into a strange receptivity. A boy wasn't left with instructions on what to see. The expectation was that the spirits would make themselves known, and they rarely disappointed. A guardian spirit might appear in the form of an animal, a bird, or even an insect. A bear offered brute endurance, a wolf cunning and solidarity, an eagle the clarity of sight, and a butterfly the delicate resilience of transformation. Whatever came, the meaning wasn't optional, it was binding. To encounter a vision was to inherit a contract, live with it, honor it, and call upon it in moments of danger. The animal became more than symbol. It was a lifelong ally, walking parallel to the warrior, even if unseen. Weakness was part of the method. Days without food blurred the senses until every rustle of wind became suspiciously intentional, every flicker of light possibly divine. Some accounts tell of boys returning hollow-eyed, trembling, yet clutching the certainty that they now carried more than their own fragile bodies. It wasn't enough to have a strong arm, you needed a spirit arm beside it. Among the plains peoples, these visions were often so precise that warriors decorated themselves accordingly. A man who had dreamt of a thunderbird might tattoo its image on his chest, convinced it would deflect bullets or guide arrows. Another, blessed by a vision of a fox, might paint his body in cunning reds and whites, believing speed and trickery were his to command. These weren't metaphors. They were armors made of belief, and belief, in battle, often proved stronger than steel. Failure to gain a vision was considered catastrophic. A youth who returned empty-handed faced ridicule, suspicion, and the gnawing fear of spiritual vulnerability. Without a guardian, he was naked before the chaos of war. Communities sometimes pressed such individuals harder, insisting they repeat the ordeal until something answered. Loneliness, starvation, exposure. The spirits had to be courted with the kind of desperation only the wilderness could provide. And the visions weren't always reassuring. Some were terrifying. Spirits could appear in grotesque or unsettling forms, half human, half animal, dripping with blood, or whispering in riddles. Enduring fear without fleeing was itself part of the test. A warrior who survived such encounters didn't just gain protection. He gained the reputation of one who had stood face to face with the uncanny and not broken. By adulthood, a man's identity was inseparable from his spirit ally. Songs, dances, even personal taboos grew from that initial vision. A man blessed by a deer spirit might never eat venison. One tied to a bear might carry claws around his neck. These weren't quirks, they were survival contracts, constantly renewed. When war came, a warrior didn't walk into battle alone. He carried with him the bird, beast, or ancestor that had chosen him. Each swing of a weapon a duet between flesh and spirit. And because no army could be built on solitary visions alone, communities crafted collective rituals, communal invocations, to ensure that the spirits weren't just allies of individuals, but patrons of the whole war party. When a war party was about to move, it didn't simply grab weapons and march. Preparation was an act of choreography, half strategy and half invocation. Warriors gathered not just to sharpen arrowheads or test bowstrings, but to paint, sing, smoke, and plead with powers that would never be visible on the battlefield, yet determined how it unfolded. Body paint was the most obvious sign. Stripes of red across the chest didn't mean team colors, they meant blood, vitality, the readiness to take life or give it. Black smeared across the face wasn't eyeliner, it was invisibility, a shield believed to cloak the warrior from the gaze of enemies and spirits alike. White, yellow, blue each carried its own set of meanings, ancient codes written on skin with clay, charcoal, or crushed plants. When men lined up painted in these colors, they weren't just warriors, they were walking petitions to the supernatural. Weapons, too, had to be handled properly. Arrows were held over smoke to bless them. Muskets passed through ritual fires. War clubs marked with carvings of spirit animals. To carry a weapon without blessing was to risk failure before the first blow. A stone-tipped spear wasn't merely sharpened, it was introduced to the spirit world, sworn into service as much as the man holding it. The ceremonies could be elaborate. Some groups danced for hours, stamping rhythm into the ground until the earth itself seemed to pulse in sympathy. Songs rose, not as entertainment, but as reminders to the spirits that they had debts to pay, alliances forged in visions, sealed in offerings. A war cry shouted into the night wasn't only for morale, it was a spiritual flare, signaling that battle was coming and the unseen had better show up. Silence had its place. Before certain raids, men withdrew into seclusion, observing taboos: no sex, no heavy meals, sometimes no speaking at all. To break these rules was to court disaster, inviting spirits to look elsewhere for allies. A raid could unravel not because the enemy was stronger, but because someone got careless with ritual purity. Communal feasts were another paradox. Food, often specific types, was shared to bind the group together before the fast of combat. Corn, venison, or sacred drinks might be consumed in portions and sequences dictated by tradition. It wasn't nutrition. It was covenant. The spirits needed proof that the community moved as one, that the warriors weren't just individuals but extensions of something larger. The air before a raid was thick with smoke, chants, and the smell of sweat mingled with herbs. It was tense, but not chaotic. Every act had meaning, every gesture its place in the ritual machinery of war. A warrior who entered battle without these preparations might as well have walked in naked, armed in body, defenseless in spirit. And once the rituals ended, the night carried a different weight. Dreams were watched carefully, omens read in the flicker of firelight, in the flight of birds, in the sound of wind. For what happened in dreams wasn't dismissed as fantasy, it was treated as reconnaissance. The spirits sent maps in symbols, warnings disguised as riddles, strategies whispered in sleep. The night before a raid wasn't for sleeping soundly. It was for listening to the kind of messages that arrived only when the body surrendered and the mind slipped sideways. Dreams weren't private amusements. They were dispatches from the spirit world, reports drafted in strange symbols. To ignore them was reckless. To misinterpret them was worse. A dream of a deer might signal speed, urging the war party to strike swiftly and withdraw. A snake could warn of ambush, its coils mirroring the traps waiting in the underbrush. Thunderbirds streaking across the dream sky could be read as promises of overwhelming victory or storms that might turn arrows aside. Every detail mattered. Did the animal approach or flee? Was the path clear or blocked? The tiniest image could be interpreted as a tactical map, delivered free of charge by the cosmos. Leaders consulted dreamers with the seriousness of generals poring over reconnaissance reports. Shamans too played their part, interpreting the symbols, weighing their consistency with other signs. The flight of birds at dawn, the crack of a tree branch, the flicker of fire smoke. Strategy wasn't written on parchment. It was read in the fabric of chance, woven by spirits into the subconscious. Sometimes, entire raids were postponed or cancelled because of a dream. A warrior might rise at dawn, pale, insisting that the spirits had warned against leaving. To disregard such a message was to court disaster. No amount of sharpened blades could protect a war party marching against the will of the unseen. Better to wait, to seek another sign, to adjust course until the cosmos gave its grudging approval. And of course, dreams could embolden. A man who dreamt of triumph might return to camp with a swagger that spread through the party like fire through dry grass. His confidence wasn't arrogance, it was proof of supernatural endorsement. To fight alongside him was to fight with the spirits already leaning in your favor. The eerie part was how easily dreams became contagious. One man's vision could shift the mood of dozens. Fear or courage wasn't just psychological, it was spiritual contagion. A dream of failure might chill an entire group, their weapons heavy in their hands before a single blow was struck. A dream of triumph could make them reckless, believing arrows would curve away, bullets would misfire, and the very earth would tilt toward victory. Europeans, of course, sneered at such practices, as though they themselves didn't consult astrologers, saints, and holy relics before marching armies. The difference was scale. Native warriors trusted the privacy of a single dream as much as European generals trusted the calculations of scribes. Both were gambling with lives. Dreams weren't the only bridge between spirit and strategy. While a man's subconscious could deliver omens, shamans and spiritual specialists played their own visible role, turning battles into theaters where unseen forces were invited to intervene directly. Every war party needed weapons, but none dared leave without its most volatile tool, the shaman. He wasn't swinging a club or drawing a bowstring. He was negotiating with the unseen, persuading spirits to join the fight the way diplomats persuade fickle allies. A shaman's work wasn't measured in kills, but in invisible favors. Arrows glancing aside, storms arriving on cue, dreams shifting from ominous to reassuring. Before battles, shamans prepared charms and talismans, bundles of feathers, claws, bones, or stones wrapped with herbs. These weren't souvenirs. Each one was a contract, a promise that the bearer carried the protection of spirits. Warriors tied them to weapons, to their hair, to their belts, trusting that the smallest token might be the difference between life and death. The rituals were never casual. A shaman might paint warriors with patterns meant to confuse enemies or blind hostile spirits. He might chant, burn sage, or call on animals whose power could cloak the men in stealth. Some blew smoke over weapons, others rattled gourds, shaking air into a rhythm that blurred the boundary between the ordinary and the supernatural. The shaman's role was to ensure that the war party didn't walk into combat as mere men, but as vessels of something greater. And when outcomes soured, the shaman was the first to be questioned. Victory brought honor to the warriors. Defeat was often laid at the shaman's feet. Had he failed to interpret the dreams correctly? Did he offend a spirit by fumbling a chant? Shamans carried enormous authority, but also crushing responsibility. To be a spiritual mediator was to live with constant suspicion. A mistake in ritual timing could look like treachery. On the battlefield itself, some shamans took active roles. Accounts describe medicine men striding into combat painted in stark colors, singing loudly, rattles in hand, seemingly oblivious to danger. Their confidence wasn't bravado, it was a weapon. To show no fear, to act as if bullets and arrows were irrelevant, was to project the certainty that spirits stood between them and harm. And sometimes, belief was enough. Warriors who trusted in their shaman fought harder, surer, convinced that the universe itself was on their side. Of course, there were limits. Shamans couldn't conjure infinite arrows or feed empty bellies, but their influence shaped morale as much as it shaped cosmology. A war party that believed its charms were strong could endure hunger, fatigue, even despair, with the conviction that unseen allies walked beside them. The psychological edge was profound, and in small-scale warfare, psychology was often decisive. To European observers, shamans looked like charlatans. To their communities, they were indispensable. Their words carried weight equal to that of chiefs. Their rituals treated as serious as any weapon cache. Where Europeans invested in gunpowder, native nations invested in spiritual diplomacy. The return wasn't measured in coins, but in survival. And just as shamans could call spirits into battle, warriors themselves embodied these alliances through symbols and adornments. Animals weren't distant metaphors, they were chosen allies, worn and invoked as co-fighters. On the battlefield, the warriors didn't just bring weapons. They brought foxes, eagles, bears, wolves, and thunderbirds, none visible, all present. Animals weren't mascots or pretty decorations. They were allies, recruited through visions, rituals, and memory. To fight meant to fight with fur, feather, and claw woven into one's own flesh. Bears stood for endurance and raw force. A warrior who carried bear claws strung around his neck wasn't only intimidating, he was announcing that the bear itself had agreed to stand behind him. Wolves offered cunning and loyalty to the group. Warriors painted with wolf symbols were thought to be able to track enemies as easily as prey. Eagles gave sight from above. Feathers tied into hair or lances promised clarity and swiftness. Even small creatures mattered. A dream of a butterfly could be mocked by outsiders, but within the community it could mean resilience, the ability to transform, to outlast, to endure hardship with beauty. These animals weren't just symbolic, they dictated rules. A man with a deer spirit might never touch venison again, a taboo that ensured his bond stayed unbroken. Another, tied to a bear, might be forbidden from mocking or harming bears under any circumstance. These were not suggestions. They were binding pacts, carried into every battle as obligations. Breaking them risked more than Shamit, risked entering combat alone, stripped of the invisible army promised by the spirit world. Armor itself became a declaration of alliances. Shields bore painted animals, war clubs were carved with talons or wings, arrows decorated with feathers that recalled the chosen ally. To strike with these weapons wasn't only to swing wood or stone, it was to channel the ferocity of the animal woven into the weapon's design. Every painted line, every feather attached, was a reminder that the fight wasn't human against human. It was a gathering of species, of forces natural and supernatural, converging on one patch of ground. War cries carried the same logic. A scream modeled on the howl of a wolf or the screech of a hawk wasn't just meant to terrify enemies, though it certainly did. It was a signal, a declaration. The wolf is here, the hawk is circling, the spirits have arrived. Enemies didn't just face men, they faced the beasts those men had pulled into their lives through vision and ritual. The irony is that Europeans dismissed all this as superstition, even while decorating their own coats of arms with lions and eagles, as though embroidery had more legitimacy than paint. One society painted animals onto shields and believed in their presence. The other embroidered them onto banners and convinced itself of divine right. Both trusted in the same idea: you don't go to war alone. And yet, for native warriors, alliances with animals weren't just for show. They were enacted, embodied, sung into being during combat. And sometimes, they tipped the balance not through claws or wings swooping from the sky, but through the terrifying conviction that no arrow, no bullet, no blade could ever pierce the hide of a man backed by spirits. That conviction, however, needed constant renewal. Rituals didn't end once a battle started, they stretched into combat itself, woven into acts meant to keep the spirits close and the balance intact. Battle wasn't only about blades clashing or arrows flying. It was a stage where every movement carried meaning, and meaning carried power. A warrior stepping onto the field didn't just fight, he performed. Songs, gestures, cries, even silences were woven into the fabric of combat, inviting spirits to step in and tip the balance. The first scream of a charge wasn't random noise. It was a war cry sharpened by generations, tuned to echo animal allies or ancestral voices. A howl could summon the wolf, a shriek, the hawk, a deep roar, the bear. These weren't metaphors. To those listening, the spirits answered in those cries, lending strength and striking fear. Enemies heard more than men approaching, they heard an entire menagerie of unseen forces closing in. Weapons, too, were part of the ritual. Before a spear pierced flesh, it might be lifted toward the sky, acknowledging the spirits above. Arrows were sometimes sung over mid-battle, chants slipping between breaths as the warrior loosed them. Clubs carved with symbols weren't just swung. They were brandished, displayed as if to remind the cosmos of its obligations. Even the act of touching the ground before a strike was a gesture of anchoring, calling on the earth itself to steady the blow. There was theater in defiance as well. Some warriors deliberately exposed themselves to danger, stepping forward painted in stark patterns, chanting loudly, rattles in handars, if to demonstrate that spirits made them untouchable. Confidence was contagious. To watch a man dance amid arrows without flinching was to believe that perhaps the arrows really would bend away. And sometimes, belief itself shifted the battle more than the weapons did. Songs threaded through combat, not in harmony but in raw defiance. Each warrior might carry his own personal song, gifted through visions, sung aloud as both shield and declaration. To hear dozens of such songs rise together was to step into a soundscape where every note claimed spiritual sanction. The air thickened, not only with dust and sweat, but with voices insisting that victory had already been decided in another realm. Even silence had its place. A sudden pause before a strike, a war party holding still in absolute quiet, carried its own weight. Silence wasn't emptiness, it was concentration, a drawing in of invisible allies before the release of violence. The absence of sound could unnerve enemies more than shouting, as though the spirits themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the moment of eruption. Defeat, too, was written. A warrior caught, tortured, or killed wasn't erased, he became part of the sacred theater. Singing defiantly while bound wasn't bravado. It was an act of ensuring the spirits still recognized his courage, still kept the balance in favor of his people. Dying without a song was considered dangerous, as though silence at the end might allow the spirits to forget their promises. In this way, every battle was layered. What outsiders saw as chaos was actually choreography, chants, cries, gestures, silences, all designed to weave the spiritual and the physical into one performance. A performance where the audience wasn't just human, it was the spirits whose approval meant survival. And when those spirits turned away, when arrows struck truer on the enemy's side, communities didn't chalk it up to poor tactics. They read it as failure, a rupture in the alliance between men and the unseen. When a war party limped back, fewer in number and heavy with silence, the wounds weren't just counted on bodies, they were tallied in the invisible ledger between humans and spirits. A defeat wasn't brushed off as poor luck or tactical misstep, it was scrutinized as a cosmic failure. Something had gone wrong in the invisible chain of obligations, and the result was written in blood. The questions began almost immediately. Had the rituals been performed incorrectly? Did someone eat the wrong food, break a taboo, or speak out of turn during preparation? Was a weapon carried unblessed, its spirit ally neglected? Suspicion didn't fall only on human error, reached into the realm of spirits themselves. Perhaps they had been offended, overlooked, or bribed by the enemy's shamans. The battlefield wasn't only contested by warriors, it was contested by the unseen powers who might favor one side for reasons no human could fully grasp. Communities often responded to defeat with ritual cleansing. Warriors bathed, fasted, or abstained from ordinary pleasures to repair whatever breach had been made. Some groups held ceremonies specifically to wash off the failure, symbolically removing the stain of defeat so that spirits would not see them as tainted in future battles. Without such cleansing, the fear lingered that misfortune would follow them into every fight. Blame could fall heavily on shamans. A botched chant, a poorly timed offering, an omen misread. These failures might explain why arrows flew straighter for the enemy. A shaman could rise in stature after a victory, or be quietly sidelined after a loss, his authority crumbling with each misfortune. Spiritual warfare was as political as it was mystical. The irony is that while Europeans recorded these interpretations with disdain, they did much the same in their own wars. Defeats were blamed on God's disfavor, sins in the camp, or kings who had angered heaven. The difference was one of vocabulary, not of logic. To both, battle outcomes were judged in divine light. But for native warriors, the consequences reached deeper into daily life. A defeat was a breach in the balance of the world. It meant the community itself risked instability. Crops might fail, illnesses spread, enemies grow bolder. People didn't see war as a self-contained event. It was part of the cosmic web. Tugged too hard in the wrong direction, and the whole structure quivered. Even captives and losses were interpreted spiritually. A dead warrior wasn't only a son, husband, or father lost. He was evidence that spirits had withdrawn their protection. His absence had to be explained, his death framed within ritual narratives to keep despair from consuming the community. Otherwise, grief might spiral into doubt, and doubt into paralysis. Defeat was, in this sense, a public crisis of meaning. Warriors returned with wounds. Shamans scrambled to explain. Communities gathered to cleanse and reset. And still, beneath the ceremonies and chants, the fear remained. Perhaps the alliance with the spirits wasn't as strong as believed. It was this fear that pushed communities to double down, to seek stronger visions, to secure more powerful allies from the other world. For if the spirits could abandon them, they could also be persuaded to return through fasting, sacrifice, and the unrelenting labor of ritual. When Europeans arrived with steel, gunpowder, and a library of unkept promises, the balance of war shifted, but not entirely on their terms. Native peoples didn't simply fold before muskets. They absorbed, adapted, and, most importantly, enlisted their spirits to confront this new, bewildering enemy. Battles weren't just fought between redcoats and painted warriors. They were reframed as contests between gods, ancestors, and the invisible contracts that bound both worlds. Some saw the newcomers' weapons as terrifying, yes, but also as curiosities that had to be explained in spiritual terms. Muskets weren't only machines, they were thought by some to carry power from European spirits. And if the spirits had given them such tools, native shamans reasoned, then countermeasures were required. Stronger rituals, deeper fasting, fiercer visions. Bullets might be deflected if warriors were properly shielded by charms, feathers, or songs. Confidence in these protections wasn't naivety, was strategy, psychological armor against the alien technology. Resistance movements often fused traditional spiritual practices with responses to colonial encroachment. The ghost dance in the 19th century is one famous example, a ritual promising that the spirits would sweep away European settlers, restore the land, and bring back the buffalo. To outsiders, it looked like desperate superstition. To participants, it was cosmic warfare, a last alliance with the ancestors to turn history back in their favor. In earlier centuries, similar dynamics unfolded. During the Beaver Wars, the Iroquois drew upon rituals and visions, not only to strike their native rivals, but to navigate the bewildering alliances offered by Dutch and English traders. To face firearms supplied by Europeans, they doubled down on spiritual preparation, interpreting victories and losses as indicators of which spirits were winning the larger contest. Colonial officials, of course, scoffed until they noticed how powerful this conviction could be. A warrior convinced that spirits had made him bulletproof could fight with a fearlessness that unnerved even professional soldiers. Confidence, even misplaced, had its own tactical value. Europeans themselves often reinforced this by accident. When bullets misfired, or enemies survived impossible odds, it confirmed native beliefs that spirits were intervening. Shamans found themselves on the front lines of this spiritual clash. Some adapted, incorporating elements of Christian imagery or European objects into their rituals, reframing them as proof that native spirits could bend foreign powers to their will. Others resisted fiercely, declaring that the new gods were hostile invaders who had to be fought not just with weapons but with ceremonies strong enough to unmake them. And so, battlefields during the colonial era weren't only muddy grounds of gunsmoke and blood. They were theaters of competing cosmologies. Every shot fired was doubled by a chant, every victory judged as much by omens as by body counts. The unseen world was still the decisive factor. But as centuries wore on, colonial manipulation, trade, and alliances twisted these spiritual contests into harsher realities. Wars that had once restored balance now fed imperial ambitions, and spirits were dragged unwillingly into cycles of violence that no longer belonged entirely to the people who invoked them. Long after the last musket fired, and the treaties were signed in rooms full of bad handwriting, the memory of spiritual warfare lingered. It clung to stories, to songs, to the bones of landscapes where battles had been fought under the gaze of spirits as much as enemies. To speak of war in native traditions was never just to recount strategy or bravery, it was to acknowledge alliances with powers that had outlasted men, guns, and empires. The legacy is clearest in oral traditions. Songs carried forward the visions of warriors long gone, reminding descendants that survival had not been a matter of chance but of spiritual negotiation. A chant sung before a modern powwow might echo a battle cry once meant to summon thunderbirds over a battlefield. Stories of dream visions are still retold, not as quaint folklore but as evidence that victories and defeats were written in more than flesh. Archaeology adds another layer. Shields painted with animal figures, pipes buried beside warriors, charms found in graves. These objects weren't decorations. They were the remnants of contracts, evidence that even in death, warriors stayed tethered to their spirit allies. Excavated weapons marked with animal motifs speak to the same logic. Alliances had to be declared in every stroke of paint, every carved line, every feather tied to a shaft. The irony, of course, is how Europeans often dismissed these practices as superstition, only to practice their own versions under different names. Soldiers marched into battle with saints, medals, crosses, or relics of holy figures, convinced these trinkets could deflect bullets just as surely as a painted feather. The difference was not belief, but vocabulary. Both worlds clung to the conviction that no one went to war alone. The legacy also shows in the persistence of rituals of cleansing and renewal. Communities still honor fallen warriors with ceremonies that link the physical act of loss to the spiritual balance of the world. These practices preserve the older idea that a death in war is never just a body on the ground, it is a tear in the fabric of relationships with ancestors and spirits, one that must be mended. Even resistance movements, centuries later, drew on this inheritance. The ghost dance, the peyote rituals, the blending of Christian and indigenous practices all carried the same core idea. Battles, whether against neighboring tribes, invading settlers, or colonial governments, could not be won without spiritual alliances. The visible fight was only the echo of the invisible one. What endures most, perhaps, is the reminder that war was never purely mechanical. Guns, arrows, fortifications all were secondary to the conviction that the cosmos itself could be persuaded, cajoled, or coerced into taking sides. For native peoples, spirits were not abstractions. They were participants, allies who had to be courted like kin, feared like storms, and obeyed like elders. And that legacy still unsettles, because it blurs the neat lines between myth and history. To reduce battles to tactics alone is to miss half the story, the half that made warriors stride into combat singing to animals no one else could see, convinced that their footsteps shook the earth, not because they were many, but because the unseen walked with them. For many indigenous societies across North America, victory in war wasn't measured only in scalps or spoils. It was measured in the living bodies dragged back to the village. Capturing enemies alive had a gravity all its own, part punishment, part performance, part raw material for either adoption or execution. A captive was a symbol, a breathing reminder that one side had power over the other, and everyone in the community needed to see it. Unlike European battlefields, where fallen enemies were left to rot or buried in haste, native warfare often ended with a long journey home for the unfortunate survivors. Prisoners marched back under guard, sometimes mocked, sometimes beaten along the way, stripped not just of weapons but of the illusion that their story would end quickly. Their bodies became political currency, to be displayed and debated before a crowd rather than hidden away in a ditch. The reasons weren't random. Warfare in these contexts wasn't about annihilation. It was about restoring balance, avenging losses, or absorbing strength. A dead warrior on the field could be forgotten. A living captive could be used to heal the rift left by the death of a kinsman. Communities expected losses, and they expected repayment. Captives filled that demand. Sometimes they were adopted, given a new name, folded into the family of the one who had lost a relative. Other times, they were put to death in ceremonies that displayed both vengeance and endurance. The moment of capture itself carried meaning. To overpower an enemy alive proved not only martial skill, but spiritual favor. Anyone can kill in the chaos of a raid. It took more control, more precision, to subdue and deliver a man breathing. To return with a captive was to return with proof that the spirits had smiled on the war party. The fate of captives, however, was never guaranteed. Their bodies were contested territory long before the first blow of torture was struck. Elders weighed their usefulness. Families pressed their claims. Shamans considered omens. Would this one replace a lost son, or would his suffering balance the scales of cosmic justice? The captive stood at the intersection of grief, politics, and spirituality, awaiting a decision that was as much ritual as verdict. Europeans, confronted with these practices, recoiled in horror, yet they rarely paused to consider the logic behind them. For indigenous societies, the taking of captives wasn't casual cruelty. It was a system, one that bound communities together, regulated vengeance, and reminded everyone that war was more than a contest of weapons. It was a theater of meaning, and captives were the unwilling actors. And once the captive arrived at the village, the stage widened. What had begun on the battlefield now moved into the center of communal life, where death was never private and suffering became spectacle. Once the captive was led into the village, the war wasn't over. It simply changed venues. The battlefield shifted from forest or prairie into the open plaza, where the entire community could bear witness. Torture wasn't carried out in hidden corners. It was public theater, as structured as a religious festival, as educational as a grim classroom. Everyone had a role to play, from elders seated with watchful eyes to children pressed forward to absorb the lesson. The central fire usually marked the stage. Around it, villagers gathered, weapons at hand, not for combat but for ritual participation. The captive was displayed in plain view, tied to a post or forced to sit, surrounded by faces that radiated both anger and expectation. Here, violence was spectacle, but it wasn't mindless. It served to bind the community together, to reaffirm that the pain of loss could be answered, that the dead had not been forgotten. Women often led the chorus. They taunted, insulted, struck blows with sticks or embers. Their voices reminded everyone that war's cost was borne not only by men on the battlefield, but by families who had lost brothers, sons, husbands. Their actions were symbolic vengeance, each strike a translation of grief into pain. Children were encouraged to witness, sometimes even to participate. The message was blunt: enemies suffer, enemies die, and survival demands strength. Lessons of cruelty doubled as lessons of resilience. There was an order to the chaos. Mutilations, burns, or beatings weren't random improvisations. They unfolded in sequences inherited from tradition. Pain was stretched deliberately, extended like a ritual chant that had to reach its final verse. To end a captive quickly would have been wasteful. The purpose wasn't efficiency, but endurance. Every cry, every flinch, was a note in a communal song of retribution. The captive, meanwhile, wasn't passive. He was expected to perform too. To sing his death song, to boast of his past bravery, to endure without begging. His role was to prove his own worth by defying agony, to remind even his enemies that he had been a man of courage. The spectacle worked in two directions. It honored the community's grief, while giving the captive one last chance to define his reputation. To suffer well was to achieve a strange kind of victory, even in death. To outside observers, European missionaries, traders, chroniclers, the scenes appeared barbaric, proof that savages delighted in cruelty. They recorded the details with horror, and yet failed to notice their own societies staged executions in public squares, burning heretics alive, dismembering traitors with equal enthusiasm. The village plaza and the European scaffold were cousins, both theaters of pain designed to reinforce order. One burned with torches, the other with legal decrees, but the smoke smelled the same. For the community, the spectacle didn't end with the captive's final breath. The body itself could carry ritual meaning, its treatment further shaping the message. Sometimes, however, the purpose was less about the body and more about the endurance of sound, the captive's song, the taunts, the chants, because in the end, the point was never just to kill. It was to make death echo. When captives stood trembling before the fire, it wasn't always the warriors who decided their fate. Authority often rested with women and elders, those who bore the memory of losses and the responsibility for balance. The battlefield belonged to men. The village stage, however, often belonged to mothers, widows, and gray-haired arbiters whose words weighed more heavily than arrows. Women, especially those who had lost relatives to war, were sometimes granted the right to dictate whether a captive would live or die. Adoption into the community, a path not uncommon, was often their choice. A childless woman might see in the captive a replacement for a son taken by violence. A widow could demand death, the captive's suffering standing in for vengeance owed to her husband. Each decision folded grief into power. Participation didn't end with judgment. Women also acted to struck the first blows, cut hair, smeared ash on the captive's face, mocked his weakness. This wasn't personal cruelty, it was symbolic repayment. Every insult, every ember pressed against skin, translated absence into action. They reminded the community that mourning wasn't passive, it was active, embodied in ritual aggression. Elders, meanwhile, provided structure. Their presence at these ceremonies gave legitimacy. They were the keepers of memory, the ones who remembered earlier losses, earlier captives, earlier failures. Their approval or disapproval could shape how the ritual unfolded. A nod from an old man might grant permission for cruelty to continue. A raised hand from an old woman could silence the crowd, redirecting the outcome toward adoption instead of execution. Their authority reached beyond individuals. By deciding fates, elders and women reinforced communal law, binding memory of the dead with justice for the living. The captive wasn't judged only for his own deeds, but as a stand-in for the wider enemy, a vessel of collective blame. When the old chose death, they were sentencing not just the man tied to the post, but the idea of the rival tribe itself. Children, pressed forward by parents, absorbed this hierarchy. They saw their grandmothers and grandfathers making choices that carried the weight of gods, and they learned early that vengeance was not spontaneous rage. It was structured, deliberate, sanctioned by those who knew loss most intimately. To grow old in such a world was to become both witness and judge. The sight of elders calmly overseeing torture unsettled European chroniclers. They imagined grey hair as a guarantee of gentleness, as if age automatically softened cruelty. Instead, they found it sharpened by memory. The older the witness, the longer the list of names carved in grief, the deeper the insistence that justice be balanced before the eyes of the community. And so, the spectacle gained weight. It wasn't just the strength of warriors on display, but the voice of women and elders, transforming vengeance into legitimacy. They turned torture into something more than violence. They turned it into law, enacted in flesh. And once authority had spoken, the rest of the village ensured that the verdict was carried out in full, not in haste. Pain was stretched into a drawn-out ritual, each moment designed to prolong endurance rather than end it. Once judgment was sealed, the captive's body became a canvas. Death was never meant to be quick. The art of torture lay in its duration, in stretching pain into hours, sometimes days, until endurance itself became the central performance. Efficiency would have been wasteful. What mattered was the spectacle of how much a human body could suffer before it surrendered. Fire was the most common instrument. Captives were tied to stakes, flames licking not to consume but to sear in increments. Small torches or glowing embers were pressed to skin, pulled away, pressed again, each touch designed to prolong the agony without ending it. The goal wasn't a blaze but a slow burn, like a grim dialogue between flesh and flame. Cutting and mutilation followed similar logic. Fingers and toes were removed one by one, each slice accompanied by mocking taunts or ritual chants. Scalps were sometimes taken while the captive still lived, the exposed skull rubbed with ash or hot sand. To modern sensibilities, it reads as grotesque cruelty. Within the community, it was choreography measured, deliberate, rooted in custom. The captive's role was as important as the tormentor's. He was expected to endure, to sing his death song through clenched teeth, to boast of his bravery even as his body was dismantled. Pain was the medium, but reputation was the message. A warrior who begged for mercy dishonored not only himself, but his people. A warrior who laughed through torment could achieve a strange immortality, remembered as one who defied agony itself. Some methods targeted pride as much as flesh. Captives might be forced to hold burning objects, to dance with wounds, to participate in their own humiliation. Women and children struck blows, each act layering mockery onto injury. This wasn't improvisation, it was pedagogy. The community learned by watching how enemies broke or refused to break. Endurance became an inverted contest. The tormentors sought to drag pain out as long as possible. The captives sought to outlast their cruelty without surrendering dignity. Both sides were invested in length, in testing the outer edges of human suffering. Death was inevitable, but the path there was where meaning lived. To outside observers, the cruelty was shocking. Missionaries wrote of it with horror, insisting that it proved the savagery of native societies. Yet these same observers came from cultures that burned heretics, broke criminals on wheels, and staged public executions where thousands cheered. The difference lay not in the cruelty but in the honesty. Here, pain wasn't hidden behind rhetoric of lut, was embraced as spectacle, ritual, and repayment. And once the body began to fail, once flames or blades had reduced strength to tremors, the captive's endurance was judged. His screams or silences, his songs or surrender, would echo long after the flesh cooled. Communities didn't just kill enemies, they measured them, weighing courage against suffering. The next stage, however, wasn't only about pain. It was about sound. Torture demanded not just endurance of the body, but the voice to carry defiance through it. In these rituals, silence was the real disgrace. A captive who groaned, begged, or collapsed, wordless into fire became a cautionary tale. The true expectation was that he would sing loudly, proudly, without flinching as if pain were nothing more than a stage for his last performance. Death songs weren't casual verses. They were declarations, final testaments, meant to remind the crowd and the spirits that this man had once fought with honor. The lyrics varied, but the themes were consistent. A warrior might boast of battles won, enemies slain, or visions granted in youth. He might laugh at his captors, mocking their inability to break him. Every word was defiance, every note a refusal to surrender dignity. To outsiders, it looked insane. A man burning alive, still taunting the people who held the torches. To the community, it was the pinnacle of courage, the proof that true strength lay not in survival, but in how one faced inevitable death. There were stories of men who sang for hours while their bodies were dismantled, their voices carrying even as their flesh failed. A strong voice could unsettle tormentors, turning the ceremony inside out. Pain was supposed to humiliate. Instead, the captive transformed it into theater of resilience. Villagers might remember such voices for generations, retelling how an enemy sang until his last breath, refusing the gift of silence. Singing wasn't only about bravery, it was spiritual armor. Death songs were thought to guide the soul, to carry it toward ancestors, to prevent it from wandering aimlessly after torture. Words were weapons in a different register, carving pathways the body could no longer manage. To die without singing was to risk losing direction in the spirit world. Taunting was part of the script. A captive might hurl insults at his captors, declare their warriors weak, or even predict vengeance by his own kin. These weren't empty boasts, they were psychological warfare, planting unease in the hearts of those inflicting pain. After all, if a man could laugh in flames, what did that say about the power of his people, or the spirits standing behind him? For children in the crowd, the singing was a lesson. They heard that dignity outlasts flesh, that courage is louder than screams. They were learning how to face death, how to transform agony into song. The lesson was brutal but clear. Enemies might torture your body, but your voice could still win. European observers recoiled at the spectacle, yet even they recorded the strange admiration that sometimes crept in. Missionaries wrote of captives who mocked death so fiercely that their tormentors grew unsettled, even ashamed. The cruelty meant to degrade instead elevated the victim, a paradox that turned suffering into triumph. But defiance in voice wasn't the end. Torture wasn't just about how loudly a captive could sing, it was about what those acts meant cosmologically. Pain, blood, and song were offerings, not only to the community, but to the spirits that demanded balance. Every cut, every ember, every note of a death song carried weight far heavier than the body tied to the stake. Torture was never random. It was layered with meaning, a ritual choreography that linked the living to the dead and the earthly to the spiritual. Pain wasn't simply punishment. It was a currency of balance, offered up to keep the world from sliding out of order. For many communities, war itself was never just a human affair. Spirits walked with warriors, guided arrows, stirred courage. The torture of a captive, then, wasn't only revenge against flesh and bone, it was repayment to those unseen allies. Blood spattered on the ground wasn't wasted. It was a libation, a raw gift poured out to appease forces that demanded acknowledgement. The sequence of torments reflected cosmology. Fire cleansed, purifying not only the captive, but also the grief of those watching. Cutting released vitality, fragments of life force spilling into the air, like offerings carried on smoke. Taunts and chants weren't insults alone. They were spoken spells, reinforcing the boundary between us and them, ensuring the spirits understood clearly which side had triumphed. Sometimes symbolic objects were used: charcoal smeared on faces, feathers waved over wounds, ashes scattered into the flames. Each gesture folded layers of meaning into the spectacle. What appeared to an outsider as sadistic improvisation was, in fact, ritual performance. Torture doubled as sacrifice, a grim liturgy written in fire and pain. This symbolic framing is why communities tolerated its brutality. To witness suffering wasn't merely to indulge in cruelty, it was to participate in a spiritual act. The captive stood as a substitute, a vessel carrying the weight of conflict, his pain releasing tension that otherwise might have torn the community apart. His body was an altar, unwilling but necessary, on which grief and vengeance could be burned away. The act also reinforced identity. By enacting ritual violence, the community told itself who it was, what it valued, what the spirits demanded. Outsiders saw savagery, insiders saw affirmation. To fail in this duty would have been dangerous, risking imbalance, not only in politics but in the cosmos itself. Europeans, staring aghast at these rituals, missed the symbolic logic. They condemned what they saw while ignoring their own theaters of torture, burning heretics to save their souls, executing traitors in public squares under the banner of justice. Pain, everywhere, was ritualized. The difference was that native ceremonies admitted it openly. Agony was sacred currency, and captives were its reluctant coin. The symbolism didn't end with the captive's last breath. What happened to the body, the ashes, or even the bones carried its own layers of meaning. Ritual didn't close at death. It carried forward, seeping into how remains were handled, how memory was shaped, and how balance was maintained. And so, the spectacle moved from the living body into what lingered after the corpse itself, still heavy with meaning, still woven into the ritual web. Death didn't conclude the ceremony. The captive's body, scorched or broken, was rarely treated as a discarded husk. It remained heavy with meaning, a vessel still capable of shaping balance between the living and the unseen. The treatment of that body varied, sometimes preserved, sometimes destroyed, but always with ritual intent. In some traditions, the corpse might be burned, its smoke rising as a final offering. Ashes scattered on the ground or into rivers carried fragments of vitality to the spirits, a way of sealing the act so no remnant lingered improperly. Fire ensured purification, an act of closure for both the community and the cosmological scales that demanded equilibrium. Other times, the body was mutilated even after death. Limbs severed, scalps displayed, bones used as tokens. To outsiders, it looked like desecration. Within the village, it was continuity. A trophy taken from the corpse wasn't merely a souvenir, it was a tangible link to victory, proof that vengeance had been paid in full. A scalp dried in the sun or hung in a lodge carried more than hair. It carried story, lineage, cosmic repayment. The body also served as a warning. Displayed at the edge of a village or left in visible places, it spoke a language clearer than any declaration. Enemies would not only die, but die publicly, and their remains would testify to it long after voices had gone silent. Communities didn't waste suffering, they extended its resonance into the very landscape. Yet not every body was reduced to ashes or trophies. Sometimes, captives were transformed posthumously through adoption rituals, symbolically claimed as kin even in death. A burial within the community could mark the moment when vengeance was considered fulfilled, when grief had been balanced, when hostility was ritually disarmed. Even then, the corpse wasn't just buried, it was rescripted, shifted from enemy to symbolic member of the group. European accounts, predictably, reacted with horror, seeing grotesque savagery in the spectacle of burned corpses or scalped heads. But the logic was neither random nor gratuitous. To indigenous societies, a body was never inert, was active, charged, capable of extending meaning into the spiritual world. How it was treated determined whether the balance of war was properly closed or dangerously left ajar. In this way, the captive's body became a final offering, not only to spirits but to memory itself. Villagers could point to trophies or graves as proof that vengeance had been enacted. The dead continued to speak, their remains serving as silent guarantors that cosmic debts had been paid. The story, however, didn't end in the plaza or the grave, because torture, mutilation, and offering weren't only about this life, they carried consequences into the next. And what a soul endured after the body failed could matter even more than the scars it left behind. The agony carved into a captive's flesh wasn't only for the satisfaction of the living, it reached deeper, aimed at shaping the invisible terrain of spirits, souls, and cosmic debts. Communities believed that pain could echo into the next world, either guiding the soul on its way or ensuring it staggered, broken, unable to return and wreak vengeance from beyond. Torture was both battlefield and exorcism, a ritual that sought to cripple not just the body but the shadow it left behind. The captive's suffering gave shape to grief. Families who had lost relatives to war could see balance restored before their eyes. Each scream or defiant song became a substitute for the absent voice of their own kin. In this way, mourning was made tangible, no longer a silent weight, but something enacted in public, where memory and justice collided. The psychological relief was real. Vengeance didn't erase loss, but it made it bearable, structured, digestible within ritual. For warriors, the ceremony reinforced identity. Watching an enemy endure, boasting to the end, reminded them of the stakes. Tomorrow, it might be their turn at the post. Better to learn from a rival's defiance, to prepare their own death song, to steel themselves for agony that could not be avoided. Torture was, perversely, also training. It was a lesson written in fire. This is what courage looks like when all else is stripped away. For children, the psychological function was initiation by sight. They learned that enemies were not abstract but embodied, that suffering was part of the rhythm of life. These ceremonies etched the reality of war into their imaginations, binding them early to the community's expectations of bravery and endurance. Childhood was never sheltered. It was tutored in cruelty as much as resilience. Spirits, too, were thought to demand repayment. A life lost needed a life answered. If not, imbalance festered droughts, sickness, failures in hunting. Torture was not random sadism, but an insurance policy against cosmic disorder. The captive's suffering appeased unseen allies, feeding forces that could otherwise turn hostile. Cruelty became ritual maintenance, an offering to ensure crops grew and rivers flowed as they should. The symbolism stretched further. By forcing captives to perform courage, the community borrowed strength from them, even in death. Their endurance was admired, incorporated, almost consumed. It's a paradox only ritual can hold. The same people who inflicted agony might later praise the captive's bravery, retelling his song as if his spirit now contributed to the strength of the victors. Outsiders rarely understood this duality. To missionaries, it was savagery without logic. To the community, it was sacred necessity, psychological relief, spiritual repayment, cultural reinforcement, all intertwined. Pain wasn't indulgence, it was function. Without it, grief lingered, spirits turned restless, and balance tipped dangerously off course. And yet, while torture carved its lessons into the mind and soul, it also carried political weight. Pain was never private, was always public, and public meant political. Every ember pressed into skin, every scream that rose into the night air, carried a message that reached far beyond the captive himself. Torture was never simply about punishing one man, it was about sending signals. Villagers didn't just avenge grief, they advertised strength. Pain became a kind of political broadcast, a grim announcement to friend and foe alike. Cross us, and this is your future. The spectacle warned rivals. Word of a slow ritual death traveled quickly across rivers and forests. Stories carried by traders, captives who escaped, or spies lurking at the edge of a crowd spread the reputation of a people. The brutality was intentional, a living deterrent. Why fight us, the ritual asked, when you could be adopted instead of reduced to ash? Political theater, wrapped in smoke and agony, worked better than a treaty. It also reassured allies. Communities tied by kinship or alliance could see proof that vengeance was honored. The blood of a captive stood as evidence of loyalty. Failing to carry out such rituals risked appearing weak, unreliable, unable to protect. Power had to be displayed to be believed, and torture offered a stage large enough for the whole community to perform its resolve. Within the village, the ritual reinforced hierarchy. Leaders, elders, and spiritual figures guided the process, showing their control over violence. They decided when enough was enough, when pain had fulfilled its purpose, when death could be allowed. Their authority was stitched into the very fabric of suffering. Without their sanction, cruelty would have been chaos. With it became governance. Even gender roles carried political weight. Women avenging dead husbands or sons demonstrated that their voices held power in matters of war. Children, participating under supervision, signaled continuity, that vengeance was not just a passing moment, but an inheritance. Politics wasn't confined to councils or treaties. It lived in the ritual acts of everyone gathered around the fire. The political impact also extended to future raids. The captive's fate taught enemies that capture was worse than death. To be killed quickly on the battlefield was almost merciful compared to the long theater of pain that awaited survivors. This knowledge shaped strategies, motivated warriors to fight harder, and sometimes even deterred raids entirely. The threat of torture was as potent as the act itself. European accounts often missed the political layer, fixating instead on cruelty. They failed to see that their own gallows and scaffolds carried the same purpose: to frighten, to control, to maintain power through spectacle. Torture in native villages wasn't savagery in isolation. It was politics in flesh, governance written on a body. And when the fire dimmed, when the captive finally fell silent, the message remained. It was etched not only in memory, but in the political calculations of everyone who had seen or heard of it. Torture was never private revenge. It was public diplomacy, the sharp edge of politics carried out before the eyes of all. And yet, even politics wasn't the final layer. What lingered longest were the echoes of memory, how the dead were remembered, retold, and woven into stories that refused to fade. Once the smoke cleared, and the captive's body was burned, buried, or scattered, what remained wasn't silence. It was memory, carefully tended, repeated, and reshaped, until the story outlived both victim and tormentors. Torture ceremonies didn't end with the last breath. They lived on in narrative, becoming part of the cultural fabric that told future generations who they were and what had been endured. Children who had stood wide-eyed at the fire carried those memories into adulthood. They repeated them in whispers at night, then in songs, then in speeches before their own children. The spectacle became a story, and the story became history. A man who died defiant could be remembered with admiration, his voice woven into local lore as a model of how courage looked when stripped bare. A man who begged could be remembered as a warning, his collapse proof that dishonor outlasted even death. Communities recorded these memories, not with ink and parchment, but with ritual repetition. Dances, chants, or reenactments echoed fragments of the original torture, less as cruelty than as cultural script. The event lived on, reframed each time it was told, reminding everyone that the line between vengeance and justice was drawn not by words but by bodies. Memory served diplomacy as well. Accounts of spectacular endurance or spectacular cruelty spread across villages, shaping reputations. A community known for unflinching ceremonies inspired caution. while the memory of a particularly defiant captive might strengthen the resolve of his own people. The dead continued to fight wars long after their bodies had cooled, carried on the tongues of storytellers. For those inside the community, these memories carried psychological weight. They justified vengeance already taken, but they also warned of vengeance still owed. Grief, once ritualized, could be carried forward in story without festering into unstructured rage. In this sense, torture wasn't only about immediate justice, it was about planting a memory that disciplined emotions, giving them shape, giving them continuity. Europeans who stumbled into these stories recoiled, recording them with the same mix of fascination and disgust they reserved for tales of witches or cannibals. Yet, even as they condemned them, they too repeated them, ensuring the memory of these acts survived beyond the villages that performed them. Ironically, the voices that sought to erase indigenous practices became part of the machinery that preserved their echoes. Cultural memory also transformed torture into a paradoxical stage for admiration. Warriors who endured with defiance were honored even by those who killed them, their names or songs kept alive in enemy tales. Pain became a strange kind of immortality, bodies destroyed, but reputations surviving, sometimes more durable than monuments of stone. And so the memory endured, lingering like smoke that clings long after the fire is gone. The plaza emptied, the ashes scattered, but the story remained retold until it became not just an event but a way of explaining the world. Torture was never forgotten because forgetting would have meant letting go of grief, letting go of vengeance, letting go of identity. And that, perhaps, was the sharpest truth of all. Long after the cries had faded, the memory of pain became the real weapon, carved not into flesh but into the imagination of generations.